Scriptable objects.
What's the difference?
Well, one is just regular objects, and one is scriptable.
Holy crap, really?
Okay, hello. Welcome to my workshop on scriptable objects. What are scriptable objects, you may ask, and have already asked? Well, scriptable objects are basically data containers that you can store in an asset file. Not only that, but they're completely separate from game objects. So you don't need to attach them to game objects, they just exist. Unlike mono behaviors, which you do need to attach to game objects. If you want more information, you can go to that URL. In order to create a scriptable object, you make a class as usual, but instead of extending mono behavior, you replace it with scriptable object. Then after that, you just put in whatever attributes you want to store in that scriptable object. Say like this one, you can store a vector, a float, and a string. If you apply the create asset menu attribute to the class, then you can actually create scriptable objects or create instances of the scriptable object within the Unity editor, like without using any code. And yeah, you just right click a folder, create, and whatever path you specify. Like for example, this one I did scriptable objects / object, and it's there, scriptable objects object.
There it is.
Am I going too fast?
I had a quick question for the first slide.
Yes.
You said they're almost like the same thing as mono behaviors, except that you don't have to attach them to game object. So why would that matter?
It matters because there's some information you don't want to like keep to an object, and also since they exist independent of objects, say if you go to another scene or the object is deleted, you still have that data somewhere.
That's good.
And also, unlike mono behaviors, they don't have like a start or update, so it's like slightly less intensive. So yeah, say you create a few of these objects, then if you click on them, it opens this in the inspector where you can actually set the values of the attributes you put in. Like here I had a vector, float, and a string. So in here you can actually set those values. Like in this one I actually did 3.1, 4, and 111.11 for the vector, and yeah. So now when you use the scriptable object somewhere, you can access those values. Like for example, oh wait, I'm not there yet. The type of attributes that you can store are numbers and strings, Unity data containers like vectors, colors, rects, other stuff. I think there was like matrix 4x4 or something. Whatever that is, I've never used it. You can store game objects and components, but only of prefabs. Since scriptable objects aren't exactly in a scene, they just exist outside of one. You can't really have them reference a game object or its components, like, because they might not exist. But for prefabs, they're kind of like scriptable objects where they just exist as an asset file, so you can reference those. And you can also reference other asset files like sprites, audio files, other scriptable objects. You can reference serializable classes and structs, which if you came to my other workshop, basically they're classes or structs that you apply the system.serializable attribute to them, which lets you edit their values in the Unity inspector and also be able to convert them to JSON and store them in scriptable objects and other fun stuff. Enums and also lists and arrays of everything else. And also themselves, so you can have nested lists and arrays. You can find like the full list on that URL. I just found that link like recently. It would have been useful if I had that link earlier. Anyway, so an example of how you can use a scriptable object. Say earlier I had like this one, object 2, I called it. Basically, say you have like a script called Scriptable Object Test, and one of the attributes is called example, and it stores a scriptable object example, which the other thing I made was one. So then you can drag it from you can drag it into the inspector, and then in the start method it will actually be able to access the values. Yeah. So one use for this is, say you have like, I think, the benefits of using scriptable objects. It's useful for for loading reusable information. Like, say you have an enemy that appears a lot, and they have like certain stats. You can sort those stats in like the scriptable object, and you can always just get the values from there instead of having to just type them out every single time, or like have a prefab for each enemy, which, like I said, it stores more information. But if you store them in scriptable objects, they're smaller and easier to just put it in and access from the script. Other stuff like weapon stats of anything. Like I mentioned before, scriptable objects aren't exactly in the scene, they just exist as an asset file, or they don't need to, but they just aren't part of the scene. Which means when you transition to another scene, they don't get deleted, which is a way of persisting data, which is why I should have did this workshop before my previous workshop, but I didn't learn about this until after.
Next quarter.
Next quarter, yeah. There is a warning. For some reason, even though normally when you change values in play mode in Unity, after you exit play mode, all the values change back, but not with scriptable objects. So if you modify these values, then they get saved in the asset files. So it's not a big problem, it's just annoying if you're just trying to test something. And after you build the game and run it, when you change these values, they don't save in that one, which is weird, but if they did, it would have been an alternate method of saving data. I actually tried it once. But I said the serializable attributes of the objects, which means if you have other variables that aren't serializable, either by putting the non-serializable or non-serialized attribute to that attribute, or just using data that's not serializable like dictionaries, then even if you change them, they won't get saved because those values don't get saved. And because of that, you can do a lot more. So one of the stuff that I was researching recently is like this how to architect with scriptable objects that talk about stuff like getting rid of mono behaviors and replacing them with scriptable objects, or like just simply using scriptable objects for literally everything because they're so useful. So like I said, you can use scriptable objects to transition between, or like keep data while transitioning between scenes. And it's actually preferred over the singleton pattern. For example, you can create and these images are from that page and not actually my code. For example, you can have player HP stored inside of a scriptable object so that if you transition between scenes, it doesn't delete that information and you won't have to like store it as a static variable. So like I said, you shouldn't modify values or serializable values inside of scriptable objects. So the way they did it is that they had a non-serialized attribute called runtime value, and then they extended iSerialization callback receiver and had it so that the runtime value is set to equal to initial value. Door. Hello, are you here for the workshop?
Okay.
I wouldn't use those. Instead, I just use void on enable. It's less words. Another benefit of using scriptable objects, even when you're not like transitioning between different scenes, is that normally if you like store the player HP and say like the player script, then the other scripts that you need to use the player HP would have to reference that player object or the object that the player HP is stored on. And if something happens, like the player gets deleted for some reason, then everything breaks. But if you store it in the scriptable object, then you wouldn't even need to reference the player object. Instead, the other scripts will reference the scriptable objects, and the player script just simply modifies its value. So like these scripts don't even know that the player script exists. All they care about is the player HP value. And this is also useful if you're using prefabs, since prefabs also aren't in the scene, and you might want to load the prefab in the middle of the scene rather than having it already exist in the scene. And if you don't exactly reference them unless you hard code it in to reference those values. That's the last slide. So yeah. That was very quick. Any questions? I'm sure you all have a lot of questions.
So you said earlier that you as a warning to like not edit the values of the scriptable objects.
Yes.
But then here you're saying that the player should edit the values of the player.
I said that you shouldn't edit serializable values because those are the values that are saved in the asset file. In this one, there's two values, initial value and runtime value. Runtime value is not serialized, so it's not the value that's saved in the asset file, and that is the value that's being modified. Initial value stays the same at all times, but the only purpose is that the runtime value is set to that value. Any other questions? Okay, what time is it? That was only 16 minutes. Oh no. Okay, well, I'm sure next quarter there will be way more questions, and I'll probably have done.
Probably have like an interactive example.
Yeah, that too.
You could probably have like